The Alabama Crimson Tide should feature a very exciting defense this year, but even in that excitement, there will be some new faces who we need to talk about. And given the new information on Henry To'o, the Tennessee linebacker who put his name in the transfer portal, I think there's a guy in-house already who we need to turn our attention to, and that's exactly what we're going to do. But before we do that, as always, y'all know the drill. I want to hear from y'all. So hop down to the comments and let me know, who do you think gets the position next to Christian Harris to man the middle of the Crimson Tide defense? I'm really excited because there's a few different names, and I have my name for sure, and we're going to talk about that in a bit. But if you are new to the channel, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification, because I do constant college football content, player reviews, film analysis, talk style videos like this, and I'm on my push to 5,000 subscribers in my first year, and I'd love to have you along for the journey, and I have a lot of really cool and fun things planned for the channel, so you don't want to miss that. But now, with all that being said and out the way, let's talk first and foremost the newest information on Henry To'o. And Henry To'o, a guy that the Crimson Tide have been hot on the trail of, but because of the unknown of what the SEC will allow, and because the NCAA in general is just dragging their feet, it is looking increasingly less and less likely by the day that the Crimson Tide end up with the talented Tennessee linebacker. It's because of these rules and the uncertainty of it. Look, this is a guy who can put together a phenomenal year of football and vaunt himself to the first round of the NFL draft, and because of that, why would he sit out a year? It just doesn't make sense. He'd either stay at Tennessee or he'd go somewhere else. And we've just received news, not just a few days ago, news came out that he is going to be visiting Big Ten powerhouse Ohio State. And it's not really surprising. Remember the other day when I updated the Henry To'o information about him being back on campus at Tennessee, I brought up the institution Ohio State and how they would be looking at Henry To'o because they just lost a lot at the linebacker position. A lot of talent there for sure, but they lost a lot, and a guy coming in there that's sure with experience and has the talent of To'o is just a very hard thing to say no to. Now, the Crimson Tide are still in this, so if you are a Crimson Tide fan and you are holding out hope, the Crimson Tide are certainly in this. His father has expressed interest in the Crimson Tide, and if anything, I think that the Crimson Tide would be his preferred transfer location. But it might not be up to him because of these rules, and unless they change, like I said, every day that goes by, it's just less and less likely, because it would just take that right there. If the rules change, I think we can book it. He's going to be a member of the Crimson Tide, but until that happens, the Crimson Tide need to look inward. And there is a lot of options, but one guy in particular who I have been very impressed by in his capacities when playing, and that's Jaylen Moody. Jaylen Moody is a guy who came in to fill in the position for Christian Harris when he went down on the very first drive against Arkansas, and I was very impressed with him in his duties. I think the thing that really stood out to me the most was his communication. And there are a few things that stood out. We're going to go through them, no doubt. But first and foremost was the communication of a guy who is second string linebacker, and he was making calls. He was checking with the cornerbacks. He was checking with the defensive line, and whether he was getting someone else in position or making sure he was in the right position, he was communicating. And I'd much rather someone be communicating, making sure they're in the correct position, than being silent and not wanting to ask a question and then the whole play be busted. That's exactly why communication is key. And the fact that he was out there communicating, and actually one of the more vocal people I saw when I just rewatched that Arkansas game, which I just rewatched last night and finished up this morning. And in my notes, the first thing I have is that he was very vocal, and there were a few plays where he was actually checking with other more experienced players and adjusting them in the right position. So he seems like a very cerebral player. The other thing he has is he was a special teams demon, really making a lot of plays on special teams, so he's got a lot of athleticism. You usually aren't making special teams plays unless you have a lot of athleticism, and this guy isn't short on it. Within the Arkansas games, there were several times where he either cut off a lane in its entirety due to his athleticism, and even though he didn't make the tackle, someone else made the tackle based off of his job. or he made the tackle by running them down. This is a very athletic guy, a lot of sideline to sideline speed, which is what the Crimson Tide are going to be trying to match with Christian Harris. Now, there are certainly some guys behind Christian Harris and behind Jaylen Moody that could look to get some reps. Shane Lee was a guy who led the Crimson Tide in tackles his freshman year, and we found out he was dealing with some injuries. He's a guy that could come in here and get some reps next to Christian Harris. We know that the Christian Harris position, barring injury, is sewed up. But my bet, even though I do think that Shane Lee is more impressive than a lot of people give him credit for, is still on Jaylen Moody. And the biggest reason is because I think that Jaylen Moody is incredibly physical and he's got a nose for the play. When I was watching that game, I just talked about something where there were a lot of times where he didn't make the play, but if there was a stat that gave somebody a little check mark for making the play without ever making the tackle, he would have had a lot of them. A lot of times where he just stayed home, true to position, and forced the play inside where Will Anderson or Dylan Moses was able to get the tackle. But that tackle resulted from Jaylen Moody being able to stay home and do his job. This is a guy who I think has a lot of upside, and the only thing I think holding him back is his lack of meaningful experience at the inside linebacker position, getting reps against a first-team game-time action. It's one thing to do this in practice. It's another thing in its entirety to do it in a game setting, and when he got to do it in a game setting, he was very impressive, and I think that that can continue. And he's a guy that we need to look forward to through the spring, especially with it looking less and less likely like the Crimson Tide are able to land Henry To'oTo'o. Remember, if it was up to Henry To'oTo'o and he was able to, I absolutely believe he's a member of the Crimson Tide, but this rule has not been passed, and there hasn't even really been much talk of it being passed at the SEC level, and because of that, To'oTo'o is a guy who's way too talented to just sit around for a year and wait when he could go to somewhere such as Ohio State, which is where he will be visiting, staying at Tennessee, or even like a USC, and putting together a really solid year on film to get him vaunted to that first round. But I cannot wait to hear what y'all are thinking. The Crimson Tide have a lot of good options at this inside linebacker position, and I'm very excited for Christian Harris. This guy right here is going to put together an astronomical season. He is very impressive, and I'm very excited for whoever they put next to him. I think there's a lot of capable guys, and I cannot wait to see where y'all think the Crimson Tide will go and who your favorites are to land the position, because you know mine, and it's Jaylen Moody. If you enjoyed this, be sure to like the video, comment down below, because that really does go a long ways in helping the content creators like myself get picked up and maintained by the YouTube algorithm. And once again, be sure to subscribe. But that's it. See ya.